Well, hello, NFT.NYC community. I am here with Alex Moe, one of the software engineers at Coinbase, who has worked there for over a year on the wallet. Alex really has quite a bit of things that he can teach us about from a technical perspective. So rather than just talk Coinbase right now, Alex, I'd love for you to introduce yourself, give us some background on who you are as an engineer, and then I think it'd be fun to dive into some more tech focused questions and have you have a chance to share your perspective as a software engineer in this industry. So please introduce yourself.
So, hey everyone, my name is Alex, and as Ian had stated, I work on the Coinbase wallet team. So we won't go too much into Coinbase, but basically my tech journey was I joined Coinbase not actually because of crypto, but I had heard some other things about like the company culture, and that's why I joined Coinbase. Luckily, I got put onto the wallet team, which is one of the very Web3 facing teams, and that's when I started kind of my journey into crypto. At first I was kind of thrown in. I didn't really know how any of this stuff worked. I didn't even know what gas fees were. I'm just confused all over. But, as an engineer, you have to learn these things as you kind of like begin to do integrations with different products, so on and so forth. I'm the type of person that's like really a grinder, I would say. Like I get really annoyed if I don't understand how something works. So I kind of figure it out. And then basically, one of the things I was interested when I first joined was this concept of an NFT, which I didn't fully understand at first because I barely understood what smart contracts were, so on and so forth. So I kind of went deep and started diving into smart contracts. I learned some Solidity myself, started coding up some very scratchy, NFT contracts, and just kind of working through it. So like when I started, I would like deploy some testnet contracts, so on and so forth, work along with that, and just try to explore different concepts or types of like NFTs, including ERC-721s, ERC-155s, working around. And even at the beginning, I didn't even know about like the pre-existing frameworks of like Open Zeppelin and so on and so forth. And so I was just coding all this myself from scratch, and the more I did it, the more kind of deep I got into it. Along the way, basically, I got more and more into like how a lot of these marketplaces work or how like all this data is gathered. So I also got really into like indexing and the like of that. In terms of kind of like just to keep it a bit brief, basically, I've personally built an indexer that kind of indexes NFTs, dealt with a lot of the edge cases with both on-chain and off-chain metadata, including items like custom contracts, so on and so forth. And on top of that, in terms of like the technical side, I've personally written a ton of Solidity contracts, not just NFTs, but also delving into the DeFi world, I wouldn't say I'm like an insane expert, but I know my way around them. I follow along with all of this, like the hacks that happen. I understand the hacks. I follow along with like a lot of the optimizations and different things that come out. And yeah, that's kind of a brief overview of my background and kind of my experience working with like both like software engineering in the Web3 ecosystem as well as NFTs.
I'd like for you to give us a state of the union on wallets today from a software engineer's perspective and speaking to other software engineers. So obviously we have custodial wallets, we have non-custodial wallets, we have cold storage wallets. So in your perspective as an engineer, speaking to other engineers that might be hearing our conversation, what do you see as the state of the wallet development in the Web3 world right now?
Sure, I'll talk a little bit more about kind of self-custodial wallets as well as cold wallets. I think the general kind of entry point, so I'll talk a little bit about like, non-self-custodial wallets as well, but basically I think the general is kind of like people kind of gradually go deeper and deeper in until they get to cold wallets. And I think the kind of idea is that cold wallets are always going to be the safest, right? Because there's no way someone can do anything unless you need that physical piece of hardware. And I think that remains to be the case. However, the problems with cold wallets we encounter is like there's not as much functionality within them as say some of these self-custodial wallets, such as Coinbase Wallet, MetaMask, Phantom, the likes. I think we're starting to get into like a technological space where we're starting to do integrations within like cold wallets to some of these hot wallets that are self-custodial. And I think that's kind of like where we're at in terms of technology. And I like that. I think like a key component is trust, right? We need to be able to trust all these wallets that are coming out across different ecosystems, not just Ethereum, right? And I think I like the direction that like this is going, right? We want your wallet to be almost a representation of who you are. I'm very interested in I don't know if this is a little bit off topic to the question, but I'm also very interested in like proof of identity, proof of attendance protocol, so on and so forth. And I think like we're starting to get into a world where that's starting to become a thing. And I think that's like a really good direction for the future of like Web3 in general and like how crypto will advance throughout the world. I don't know if that like really answered your question, but it was kind of like the tangent I was kind of thinking of here.
Well, I mean, just to be clear, there's not a specific thing that we need to talk about, nor do you need to answer my question directly. I'm just prodding you with different ideas so we can hear your thoughts. I want to ask you about interoperability. So there's so much talk about interoperability amongst open metaverses. There's talk about interoperability amongst layer 1, layer 2 blockchains. When are these all going to be kind of seamless, and how are we going to get there? One thing I haven't heard much about is the interoperability of different wallets. Some people have multiple Coinbase and or MetaMask wallets. They have different wallets for different things. Where do you think the future takes us in terms of something easy for the consumer to feel like their wallets can maybe be, connected, or they can pass things from one to another? I know there's some things already in place, but some things are still kind of walled gardens. And so can you give us some insight from an engineering perspective of how do we get from where we're at to where maybe the consumer would like to see things going in terms of that seamless transition of assets from one wallet to another with no or very little friction?
I see. I personally think we're kind of almost in a way in like the early stages of wallets, right? You have like, first of all, in terms of Web3, engineers in Web3 are kind of, I would say like rare in its own way, right? Like having software engineers across the field, even Web2 is already like difficult for a lot of companies to find, but especially Web3, because Web3 is such a kind of rabbit hole for you to delve in. There's so much to know. And there's so much to know across different blockchains, right? You could be insanely like an insane expert on ETH and, for example, or EVM blockchains, and then you go into Solana and you're just like, what the heck is happening? I think that kind of like is the problem right now. There's not enough engineers in Web3 to like get us to where, this vision that we want to be just yet, right? A lot of the times you'll have like, for example, as we were talking about, there's Coinbase Wallet, MetaMask, Phantom, so on and so forth, Rainbow, whatever. All these wallets, like, they exist and they all have their own feature set that is like nice to have and great. And I think that's almost like in itself a problem. It's not necessarily a problem, I'd say, but kind of like there's always going to be some wallet that's better than another wallet, one or another thing. So you might want to use a different wallet for one thing versus one thing. So I think you're talking about like, how do we get to a point where you could like either easily switch between these wallets, which you might be able to do on like an EVM chain with your private key. You can already do that, but we're talking about cross-chain, multi-chain, so on and so forth. But I think the thing is we're not just there yet, right? Because the next thing that needs to happen is we need to have like the cross-chain wormhole bridging, all this type of stuff be better than it is right now, right? We need it to be more seamless, more integrated, and more in its own way easily understood. I think there's a lot of people really scared of like bridging because they don't understand how it works at all. Both even from not just from like a technical level, but a lot of people don't even understand how to do it from like a user level, right? I think we need to get to a point where people understand that this is something that you can do, something that's fairly easy to do, and something that's kind of like seamless, right? After that, then it'll be easier for wallets to be able to kind of follow suit and start building that in, because that's where like users will actually use that piece of the product. And on top of that, I think like right now, the way kind of the competition goes within wallets is like it's too difficult almost to spread yourself and just become like the rule of all wallets right off the bat. I think there might in the future be a wallet, hopefully Coinbase wallet, that can do this. I just think right now we're a little bit ways off of that right now, but that's like the direction we want to go into. And I think even once we get there may be some wallets that are niche in some aspects that will do different things just because of the nature of like different blockchains and what you can do on different blockchains, depending on the protocol and so on and so forth.
So talk to me a bit about the things you like most about working at Coinbase. There might be people that tune into this and they are engineers and they think, I'd love to land at a place that has resources and momentum, and I want to work for Coinbase. So what are some things that you've enjoyed about being there on staff that maybe you could share with others that may be considering applying for a job or being a part of what's being developed there?
I think there are quite a few things. So once again, the original reason I joined Coinbase wasn't for the crypto. I did not know too much about crypto. I think basically what I heard from one of my friends that previously worked there was we had like a great engineering management culture overall, right? And since being there, I think I've experienced that. I think all the managers I've worked with have been amazing, really supportive in career growth. And all of the engineers are all like very positive people. We are all able to learn from each other. Like, it doesn't really matter what quote unquote engineering level we're at. We're all able to learn from each other, take feedback. And even most recently, I've been able to like give feedback to like higher leadership and so on and so forth that is being received. And I think those are some kind of traits that I love to see in a company, that we see here at Coinbase. And I think those are like the items even outside of Web3 that, drew me here. And once again, once we're here, we have like access to some really great Web3 engineers as well as really great Web2 engineers, that I think like there's just a kind of big range that you can learn from and grow as an engineer yourself, since we're talking about the like engineering perspective. Yeah, I think that covers that part.
Can we talk about engineers that are not yet in Web3 and what your advice might be if they want to make that transition? Now, this might be an established engineer, right? Been in the game for 10, 20 years, and they're thinking, maybe I need to learn some new skills and dive into this environment, or maybe it's a high schooler or somebody in college, and they're kind of working on their degree, and they're thinking, okay, what do I want to master? What skills do I really want to focus on? What would your encouragement be for engineers that want to get into the Web3 environment to be able to produce and provide something of value to this new development? What should they be studying? What should they be learning? What should they be focused on, in your opinion?
I think the first thing is don't do it for the hype. I think a lot of people are like, here, Web3, this is something new, something cool, let's just do it. But I don't think like that's how you'll succeed, right? I think in terms of becoming a Web3 engineer, it's not very difficult to like learn Solidity and become and do Web3 engineering. But the key thing is like you have to be like, you need to be good at it, or you would want to be good at it, because like you don't want to make these mistakes that you hear all the time of like smart contracts getting hacked and people losing millions and millions of dollars, right? You really want to understand what you're doing. And I think for me personally, I'm a person who likes to like do things and try, right? And we have these test nets available that let you try these things. And I think that people that are getting into it should just learn by doing. I think there's a ton of documentation out there, but the documentation isn't like as clear and straightforward as the Web2. It's not like do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, and then suddenly you're great. It's kind of like, hey, here's some things, here's some things, here's things. So you're going to need that personality where you really kind of look at all these different pieces and can kind of be the glue that puts it together yourself, right? And it's going to be an ever growing process. It's not kind of like something where you enter and you're like, I'm just like good enough now. Like there's always going to be someone who's better than you. There's always going to be someone who like knows something about like, I don't know, even Solidity, which people consider like one of the easier kind of things to get into. Like there's always going to be someone that knows something about it that you don't, and you're going to have to learn that and become better and better. I think that's the thing, right? Like a lot of like Solidity is almost like deceptive. It's like really, really easy to like just jump into. Like the first time I wrote a contract, I'm like, holy shit, this is like the easiest thing like ever. Like I wow, like people make NFTs out of this. This is easy, right? But then once I get more and more into it, and like the more complex, like multi-contract interactions, preventing security vulnerabilities, gas optimizations, I'm like, wow, this is actually not as straightforward, right? But it's not as apparent as when people come in. So you need an engineer that can actually like look at all these pieces and continue like advancing their skills within that the sector. I think that's kind of like, I don't know if that's like advice getting in, but like thinking about that before you get in is probably prominent. And then once you get in, that's the advice to like continue growing.
So let's go a little deeper on that. So once you're in and you want to continue growing, you want to keep learning, you want to keep expanding your skills, what are some resources that you're using and your peers are using that's really helped to have ongoing education and mastery of these different new skills in this Web3 environment?
So I think, first of all, like right off the bat, there are resources available that help you get into this ecosystem, right? Personally, I use Hard Hat, which is like great resource. So they have a lot of like documentation on how to do different things, and Hard Hat provides a lot of tooling that will help you start out your development. There's also existing contracts that Open Zeppelin provides that, provide the basis of like doing a lot of things that are key for like all of these EIPs coming out. And then there's also like just a ton of documentation all over the place. So understanding and reading this documentation, understanding items like, oh, how does like a smart contract work even past like just the coding? Like how are things actually stored in the memory? How do these like rand pointers work? How does like storage work? How do you do like upgradability, so on and so forth? I know I'm talking a lot about EVM right now because that's kind of my main kind of skill set, but this applies as well to items like in Solana, such as like Candy Machine, Metaplex, and so on and so forth for the NFT ecosystem. So like kind of starting out there, and then everything after that becomes much harder, right? Like once you got all these bases that exist within these documentation, everything after that is going to be a lot of like trial and error and test nets. Like I've gone through things where I will like change my code 2 lines at a time, be like, oh, what's the gas difference if I do it this way versus that way? If I like set this in memory versus in storage, what's the gas difference? Like writing that down, learning on my own. And sometimes there might be like resources there for them, but those aren't as common. It might be harder to find specific resources for these things. And it's going to be a lot of like doing it yourself. And on top of that, it's kind of like there's a lot of people in the ecosystem that really know what they're doing. So reading like the blog posts that these people make, or even following them on Twitter and following like understanding like hacks that happen and how these happen. And almost like in a way, for me personally, I've been like doing a lot of like reverse engineering in a way. It's like, okay, so this is how the hack is explained. Let me see if I actually understand how this works, and kind of like going back and back, or even like looking at contracts that maybe like I just see or interact with. I'm like, okay, what is this contract doing? How does this interact with this piece? And like thinking about like, how do you find the vulnerabilities, the edge cases? And I think these are kind of like things that you need to like continue to do almost on a day-to-day basis in order to get better.
So I want to ask about working as an individual or working as a collaborative team. And, this could be two different directions, whether it's an entrepreneur or a small team and they have a new project and they're like, okay, do we hire a few part-time people? Do we hire one person? Do we bring them in as a partner? Or maybe it's an established company and now they have a new idea and it's like, hey, let's kick out this new idea. Let's pull an engineer. Let's pull engineers into this. Can you give some insight in terms of the times where it really makes sense to have one person solely focused on doing this because it's better for either the engineer or the end result, or where it may be much better to have a collaborative team for all sorts of reasons? What are your thoughts on working solo on a project as an engineer compared to working in a collaborative team where all of you are trying to multiply each other's efforts?
I think in traditional like Web2 engineering, you'll almost always have a collaborative team because you can work on like the same part, even like slightly apart from each other a lot, and be very productive. I think in Web3, you still would want a collaborative team overall because you're going to have Web2 elements. But in terms of like a lot of the like coding for contracts and stuff like that, it's almost, in my opinion, better to have one person, but not necessarily just like one person who does everything and then boom, you deploy it. It's more of like iterative. It's like, hey, you have one person write out some things, and you might have a second person come in and take a look and like kind of like, in its own way, like black box analyze like the code and look for securities and edge cases that the first person might have missed, and kind of like iterating on these smart contracts before you do the deployment. I think that's what I found kind of works like almost the best, because when you have two different people working on a smart contract, you run into like a lot of potential conflicts, like, if they're working side by side. And the other thing is, like, if you have your, let's say, two great Web3 engineers, which are really hard to find already, working on the same smart contract, then it's a lot harder for them to find edge cases and miss security cases if they're both doing the same thing. So the way I typically do any of my project work, this would be outside of like Coinbase. I do a lot of like smart contract project work, is I would write one pass and have, my buddy kind of take a look and then raise up like, hey, what about this edge case? Is the math here correct? Are we doing the right thing? Is this the best gas for this item? What are we doing here? What about this architecture? So kind of like they're coming into it in a way that like won't have their own bias of like, hey, this is working, right? And once they do their like iteration, I go like, okay, that makes sense, or this doesn't make sense, and then we go through another few passes. And I think that's kind of like the best way. So I guess that is still collaborative, but not in the same like traditional way, where it's just like, hey, here's a PR review and you're done, and then you can fix it later, because fixing smart contracts later is much harder, if not impossible, depending on how you wrote it, than traditional Web2 engineering.
Well, I sure enjoyed the conversation. I don't get to dive deeper on technical things with software engineers like yourself, because oftentimes I'm talking to, the executive leader in the face of the organization that's speaking at our event. We are looking forward to having you come and share at the event. I think, we want to give voice to everybody, certainly those that are making all of this technology for these amazing communities. So, Alex, thanks for jumping on. Thank Coinbase for extending your time to us for a moment. And I look forward to seeing you in New York next month.
Thanks for having me, Ian, and I hope to see you soon.
Absolutely.